question is this: where does your authority to preach come from? What makes you think it's okay to take 15 or 20 minutes even of someone's Sunday, stand up in front of the congregation and speak the Word of God? And perhaps more puzzlingly some days, what makes people sit there and listen to you? Where does that authority come from? The bishop. So this is a great question, right? So this is a great answer. There are lots of possibilities. And what I'm going to start by talking about is some very serious changes that have been happening lately in our society and in our church that have begun to put some pressure on what used to be a fairly easy answer to that question. So I'm going to start with this, and Susan shouting out the bishop is a great place to start, I think, for that segue. If you look at your prayer book in the ordination of a priest, there's a moment where the bishop does hand the new priest a Bible, and the bishop says, "Receive this Bible as a sign of your authority to preach the word." But it's only a sign. It isn't your authority to preach the word. Your authority to preach the word doesn't come from your ordination. There are plenty of lay preachers. So where then does it come from? Well, until relatively recently, we kind of had an answer to this. Thanks to our old friend who settled lots of arguments long ago that we're now having to open up again, St. Augustine. Right. He had a lot of real clear answers that were fine for a while, and now they turn out to be problematic. But the fact that it lasted for so long is where we want to start. Augustine, as you know, before his conversion, was very closely associated with the Roman culture. And Augustine, in fact, worked as a rhetor. He was a speechwriter and a public speaker. And he had a problem when he became a Christian because the rhetors were not well respected among the Christians because they were so closely associated with Roman culture. And the way they spoke, the way they wrote their speeches, what they thought about the means of persuasion were very associated with Roman culture. And so the general view among Christians was that under no circumstances, once you become a Christian, could you work as or pay any attention to the rhetors. But Augustine didn't like having no money, I imagine. And he had a very interesting view. In his book on Christian doctrine, De Doctrina Christiana, in the fourth book, which is really the first systematic homiletics text in history, he talks about the way in which classical Greek and Roman rhetoric was nevertheless still acceptable as a way of preaching the gospel. This is a pretty radical view, but what he said is, and I think here he's right, if God created everything and gave us all these tools, if you could use these tools to persuade someone to do something evil, why wouldn't you use these tools to persuade someone to do good? To persuade someone to turn away from evil and believe in the gospel. Well, this was Augustine's argument. And you know what? He won. He won a lot. Because after he writes De Doctrina, the Christian preaching, the way we understand it now, really begins. And from the day of Augustine until pretty recently, Christian preaching has been totally dominated by classical Greek and Roman rhetoric. So what does that mean? Some of you may know because you took rhetoric in college, or have read it since then, or whatever. But let me just, so for those of you who are real experts in this, I'm not here to insult you and tell you something you already know, but for those of you who don't, here's a real quick overview of Greek and Roman rhetoric. They believed that, and for the purposes of Augustine, this is what he was mostly interested in, that the purpose of rhetoric was persuasion, or one of the purposes of rhetoric was to persuade. And that the reason why you would believe, why you would be persuaded, came in one of three sources. And you may have heard these: logos, ethos, and pathos, these three Greek words. Logos, the word from where we get the word logic. Ethos, the character, where we get the word ethics. And pathos, the emotions. So these three sources, logos, ethos, and pathos, these were the ways you could persuade someone. You could persuade them with logic. You could persuade them by saying, I am a person of character, and if you want to be like me, this is what you would do. Or you could stir up their emotions and make them want to go this way or this way to satisfy an emotional need. So it's just a super quick way of thinking about that. And here's the problem. If you've been living in Western society for any period of time, like more than a week, and you've been here for a week, so this must at least be true of most of you, those three sources of authority are falling away. For whatever reason, it's no longer enough to stand up and tell someone the logical reasons why, because everybody has to do their own research. And it's no longer enough to stand up and say, I'm a great person and you should copy me, because maybe they're not really. Or maybe that's not good enough anymore. Really, that celebrity culture has started to collapse as a source of authority. Just because a person is famous or well-known or respected by some, not good enough. And we all know how easy it is to whip people up with emotional appeals, and lots of people are getting super suspicious of that too. And it has, I promise you, and you've probably noticed this, affected our preaching. If we no longer have logos, ethos, pathos to draw on, how will we be able to tell people about God? Why will they listen to us? Thank you, Nikki. Funny you should ask that question. What's happening is that these, as just genuinely, right, this is happening, it doesn't work anymore. And we're going to have to find a new way. And it turns out, but before I answer Mother Nikki's excellent question, I want to talk a little bit about sort of a little bit more of how this is happening. So Fred Craddock, great homiletician and theologian, many of you know, he wrote, "There is in our time a language crisis." And this is already 25 years ago almost. A language crisis, a general experience of the loss of the power of words. And needless to say, this means a crisis in preaching. So, where this is playing in the world is if you ask people, what do you want from your preacher? Turns out what they don't want is answers. They don't want to be told what to do. They don't want to be scolded. They don't want to be preached to, right? And there's your clue right there. I mean, it's been true for a long time, right? The famous theologian once said, nobody ever came to church to find out what happened to the Hittites, right? Like, that's not, that kind of informational teaching is not been part of our job for a long time, right? And if you look at things like congregations who fill out the OTM profile, right? Tinder for congregations, right? Where you're trying to match preachers and congregations. They used to say that biblical preaching and preaching for daily life was like the number one kind of thing they wanted from their preachers. Those are sort of coming a little bit more even, they're dropping down. They're not really being replaced by a clear winner because I don't think that the OTM has caught on to what they haven't seen this lecture yet. They haven't caught on to what they should be looking for. But they don't. They don't want a preacher who's going to stand up and say, let me tell you what we should do. They don't want to be persuaded. What they want is to be in a relationship. They want to know who you are. And that's very different than preaching based on ethos. It's not because you're so smart, or you went to seminary, or your behavior is so exemplary, or you're so respected in the community. Literally, nobody cares about that anymore. Here's what they want to know. They want to know that you love them. They want to know that we're all in this together. They no longer will follow you or listen to you because of logos, or even ethos, or pathos. They will follow you because of agape. I'm not saying that being wise and learned doesn't matter anymore. I mean, I'm a seminary professor and we're all here, that's just not going to be, nobody's going to believe that if I say that, right? It's absolutely important. But what I am saying is, in these kind of classical rhetorical constructions, for example, Augustine and Cicero and some of these other writers will say, with regard to ethos preaching, it doesn't even matter if you actually are wise or ethical. It only matters that you appear this way. And that's the part that's really collapsing across the board, right? They want you to actually be authentic, right? So where we're going to go with this is, and thank you for raising that, Yejide, because it is really important to say all of this question. I think it almost says something about my point in general to say that there isn't a universal rule, right, anymore, but that it is tied to the community, to the culture in which you're preaching. And to say that the relationship is becoming primary. So watch for that. And later when we talk about authenticity and we talk about self-awareness and we talk about relationship, then we're definitely going to be coming into questions of culture, for sure. So this question of agape, right? What does that mean, right? Obviously, you all know from your New Testament classes, 4 Greek words we translate love in the New Testament, and it's different kinds of love. Agape is the word we use for the sacrificial love of God. And I am not proposing that we base our preaching on that in a cookie cutter copy way. Right? We're not Jesus. We're not God. But to say, yeah, go figure, right? But to say that we are, that we lead our communities from a place primarily from love, right? To say we're interested in our people as who they are, and not because of what we can get from them or how pleasant our relationship is, which that's good news, that the pleasantness of our relationship isn't how we decide what to do. Okay. In fact, it does work from a perspective of other orientation. It's not about the qualities of the speaker anymore. And it is necessary, therefore, that the preacher understand and even live into and value the essential differences between the preacher and the hearers. So I'm going to give you some examples. We're going to talk a little bit about some other aspects of this task. And first I want to talk about self-awareness as a quality necessary for the preacher in this kind of relationship. You have to know which one you are. And unlike the kind of preaching that is imagined in classical rhetorical preaching, we don't have to assume, and probably ought not to assume, that your congregation is either like you or wants to be like you. So one of my favorite examples of this is a sermon that I heard where I'm sitting in the congregation with my then girlfriend, who's now my wife, and we're listening to this male preacher, and the male preacher's sermon, this is his opening line. Imagine being present at the birth of your first child. Laura leans over to me and she says, I'm trying to imagine not being present at the birth of my first child. So here is a preacher who has, fun coda to that. Our child is adopted, so neither one of us was present at the birth of our first child, right? So this sermon missed all of us, right? But clearly what happened was this preacher did not imagine the variety of experience that would be present in that room.
No.
Yeah, go figure, right? It's not, and it means that this preacher missed an opportunity to connect with people. The preacher didn't understand the essential difference between himself and the rest of the congregation. Now, when I said earlier that logos preaching was collapsing, that doesn't. I don't mean that teaching preaching or doctrinal preaching has collapsed. Catechetical preaching is very much alive. Right? And it is based on the difference between the preacher and the hearers. The preacher has knowledge that the congregation does not have. And that does not mean that the preacher, and so that kind of preaching is ruined if you forget that. If you just show up and say, shucks, I'm just a regular person, just regular folks, just like you. So I don't really have anything to tell you about the Bible that you couldn't figure out for yourself, I don't know what that is, but it's not a very good sermon. It's certainly not a very good doctrinal or teaching sermon. So in some cases, you are going to want to highlight that distinction. You are going to want to say, look, here's what I've learned. You all have given me the opportunity to study, even this week. To read the commentaries, to do all these things that you don't have time to do, and I'm here to tell you what I learned. I'm here to share with you the fruit of the time for study that y'all have given me. Here, your congregation absolutely wants you to know more than they do. So, do not hear me saying, when I say we want to be all in this together, that they want, or you should want, everyone to be the same. That's the opposite, in fact, of what I'm saying. That's the kind of preaching that is collapsing.
Thank God.
Yeah. Yeah. People want to know that you understand which one you are. So, one way to talk about that, and here's the sort of undercurrent to my thinking about this, is as an example. There's lots of ways to talk about this, but my particular interest is linguistics and rhetoric. And so a question I get often is about the use of first-person pronouns in the pulpit. Should I say I or we from the pulpit? I'm going to tell you right now, it's more complicated than you think, and it's for sure more complicated than people who want to tell you a clear answer to that question think it is. Right? Usually people will say, I. You shouldn't say I because it's exclusive. But I just proved to you that sometimes the congregation wants you to be different than they are. They want you to be able to say I and not we. It's not that we all know this. That's the whole reason why I came here to listen to your sermon about the Trinity. Or whatever. Or the Incarnation. Because you have something that the congregation does not. So already you can see that I is a little bit more complicated, but you have to highlight for the congregation this question of the relationship between you and them. And sometimes it's dependent on a distinction, right? So you can have what linguists call the primal I, right, which is this like real unique, here's me, I'm completely unique and absolutely unlike everybody else. The problem with the primal I is that it is the source of what sometimes gets called a face threat or an ego threat, right? Let me ask you this. Has this ever happened to you? You ever go into a restaurant, and there's like 4 or 5 people around the table, and you're like number 3 to order, and the waiter is coming around, and somebody ahead of you says, I'll have the lasagna. And you're like, damn it, I was going to have the lasagna. Like there's only one lasagna in the back of the, in the kitchen, right? This is the primal I, right? The primal I is like, I'm me, and everybody else is not me, right? And if somebody else gets the lasagna, then I can't have the lasagna. I wouldn't be distinctively me anymore if I had to share with somebody else. Sometimes it's good to have that primal I. When I say, that I love my wife, that's great. Other people love my wife too, but in a different way than me. And nobody gets to say that, right? Nobody gets to say, I love this person the same way that I do, right? And if they do, we got a problem. And not a preaching problem either. So this is the thing. These ways of understanding your relationship to the hearer is really important. Sometimes you really are going to be a totally distinct person from your congregation, and other times you're not. Now here's another preaching example. In the, and this gets back again to the question of culture and to sort of some of the things that Kim was talking about on Monday. If your preaching is primarily testimonial in nature, right? If you have, and now historically, testimony was not considered preaching. This was a hook or a dodge on the part of the dominant preaching culture to get around the fact that women and persons from minority cultures were really good at it. So we say, well, this is not preaching, right? This is testimony. So you couldn't preach, but you could come and give your testimony, right? Spoiler, these are sermons, right? Absolutely, 100%, these are sermons. And that recognition that's happened under this sense has really opened up our idea of what preaching is and has made some of what I'm talking about today and other times possible. In a testimonial setting, what you're saying is, essentially, this is what God has done for me. It's an absolutely unique situation. This is what God has done for me. But unlike the doctrinal academic-based I, where we're making this space, we're making this distinction, and we're saying, I have something that you don't have. Instead, it's a kind of inviting I. This is what God has done for me. I wonder what God will do for you, or has done for you. So instead of saying, imagine being present at the birth of your first child, or saying things like, sometimes as Episcopalians, we have trouble figuring out what to do with all our extra money. That you're laughing suggests to me two things. One, you know that's silly. And two, you've seen it happen. Right? It's wrong to unintentionally efface the difference between you and your congregation. That's not a relationship. Amen. That's deciding that the room is full of people just like you. And it isn't effective preaching anymore. Now, if you say that, right, if you say, hey, as Episcopalians, we're going to talk more about this later in questions of real constructing the relationship. But when you say things like, as Episcopalians, we have trouble dealing with our extra wealth, then someone in the congregation who is not having that problem for whatever reason, either because they don't have any extra wealth or they're not having a problem figuring out what to do with it, whatever. Either way, they have a question. They're trying to answer a question in one of two ways. Either the preacher is wrong or I am not Episcopalian. Neither of which ought to be acceptable to you as a preacher. So we're going to talk more about we here in a bit. But this question of I, and there are other kinds of I. I'm just going to leave you with these two, right? This very simple I, where you are highlighting a distinction between you and your hearers for a purpose, right? For a purpose of saying something that is going to serve your hearers. And this other kind where you're making a distinction between you and your hearers, but you're doing it in which not to draw a big distinction, but to invite the congregation closer. All right, does that make sense? Yes. All right. So this question of self-awareness is really key. In order to construct this kind of agape preaching, you got to know who you are and who you aren't. And this is one of the things that Kim was talking about on Monday, wasn't it? Right? When she comes and talks to the Georgia Senate, she understands which one she is. She understands that she grew up in a rural context but now lives in the city. She understands that she's a religious professional in a world of political professionals, which she also is. And she can speak about herself and her experience in a way that maintains that relationship, right? She doesn't need to pretend it doesn't exist, that difference. And sometimes that difference is the most important thing in what she's trying to talk about. All right. So another way to think about this is to think about questions of the group as a whole. When the preacher is going to use words like we, Now, a lot of homileticians, particularly some very famous homileticians, have said you should always use the word we because it's inclusive, right? Because we all learned in elementary school that we is the word that's used to talk about the speaker and one or more hearers. But it doesn't necessarily mean all of the hearers, does it? No. Well, let me give you an example. If I say to you, well, this is great because Nikki just walked out for a second. So let me give you this example. If I say to you, you know, in a minute, Nikki is going to come back in the room, and when she does, we're all going to talk for a while. Who is we?
We don't know.
Can't know, right? We're going to talk for a while. When Nikki comes back in the room, we're going to talk for a while. Does that mean Nikki and I are going to have a conversation and y'all can overhear it? Does it mean that we're all going to talk and let Nikki stand in the door like a dummy until, right, and leave her out? Are we all going to have a conversation? Right? Can't know. They're grammatically identical. So how do we decide? And who's the we in that sentence? Right? Who gets to decide is the hearer.
Wait, say that again.
Who gets to decide who is in the we group is the hearer. Yeah. Some of you made a sour face when I said that because you're like, oh, I don't think I trust the hearer to make a good decision. And if so, you are right. Except that's what happens, right? Because the speaker gets to decide what to say. But then, as Kim was talking about, in that distance between the mouth and the ear, the hearers decide get to make the meaning. So if I had said the sentence, when Nikki comes back, we'll talk for a while, each of you would have to decide what's going to happen. And not me. You know, I get to decide because I know what I think is going to happen, but so do you. And then Nikki will come back and we'll all learn together what really happens. So it's important when you're building this kind of relationship between yourself as the preacher and the hearer that you do so intentionally. That kind of we, just an unmarked, generic, unreflective, let me imagine that it's inclusive we, is not going to be good enough. Because not all the hearers will understand what you're talking about. It's like the example I gave earlier about how, you know, sometimes we have trouble deciding what to do with our extra wealth or our extra power or privilege. Some hearers will hear that differently. Now, there's also other kinds of we that should be looked out for that, again, construct the relationship in a different way. So, for example, there's one kind that I call the nurse's we, right? This is the, are we ready to take our medication now? Okay, you first. Right? Because that doesn't even include the speaker, right? That we deliberately excludes the speaker. But the reason why the speaker used the word we there was to create a fictive grouping, a we grouping, right? Hey, we're all in this together, except we're not all in this together, right? We are not all in this together because the nurse is definitely not taking a fistful of giant pills, right? So it's important, and you can't do this to your congregation. They will respond exactly the same way you all did to the nurse's we, except preachers do it all the time. Well, it's stewardship season, and we're going to have to raise our pledges. You too, preacher? Maybe. And if so, you should say so straight out from the pulpit, right? Because otherwise, is going to sound like, are we ready to take our medication now? So this sense of who is the we. So here's another one. So there's this sort of nurses we, there's of course the academic we or the royal we, right, where we say we, but really it's just me. Like the queen, or I guess now the king. I don't know, I haven't heard the king do this or do much of anything yet. It's only been a year. But to say, or judges, right? To say, this is what we have decided. And it's meant because that person is speaking on behalf of the whole society. So that we has more behind it than it sounds like. When some of your teachers may have told you not to write we in a paper, like, in this paper we will show, right? And you're like, who? Who besides you is going to show this in your paper, right? But that is, that we is sort of rhetorically plural to kind of suggest the idea that, this includes me and all the people that I will convince, right? Like the scientists are going to show this, right? Or whatever. But is that really the kind of relationship you're trying to have with your congregation? Sometimes. Because when you talk about positions, political or social positions or whatever that the Episcopal Church takes, that's exactly what you're going to do. You're going to stand up and say, we decided to back this environmental program, or, we decided to commit to the, to the Paris Agreement. And your congregation is like, nobody asked me to agree to that. I'm just sitting here, right? But they are. They're part of it now because they're part of the Episcopal Church. So these we groupings are not obvious. And it's not enough to just say we, to fold people in. We're going to go on a journey, he says, as an example. Yeah, that's a great example. That happens all the time from the preacher, right? Because it sort of suggests, and this is what, it's the opposite of the authoritative I, right? Where you're going to say, this is what I learned this week about the Hittites, and I'm going to tell it to you, right? So instead, it's like, we're going to go on a journey of discovery like we haven't figured this out, right? And the syllabus is like this too. Some of your professors may have done this in college or maybe even in seminary. You say, this semester we will investigate. They've already investigated this, I just want to tell you. Unless you're in some kind of like super high-level seminar, only you are going to do the investigating, right? Professor, no investigation going to happen, right? And it's exactly that same kind of thing. Right, so the Nicene Creed is a great example, right? For a number of reasons. One of which is, even though we say it, we might not actually believe all the things. Like somebody might be like, have you ever done this? Like in a group where you say, we're going to recite the Nicene Creed, but if there's a section you're not real sure about, you should sit down for it. Put a couple hundred people in your congregation and try this. You'll learn a lot about them, probably more than you wanted to know, so maybe you shouldn't do that. But yeah, not everybody necessarily thinks the virgin birth, right, or whatever, right? Or, as I think you were kind of hinting at, believe it the same way, right? So I'm prepared to say that, but I don't think I mean what you mean when we both say that, right? And so who is the we in the Nicene Creed, right? It's the church. And it's actually fair to say that's what we believe, what the church believes, even if it's not what every individual one of us believes. And that is also uncomfortable for a lot of people under postmodernity, right? Because they'll say, I don't want to say the Nicene Creed because I don't believe that. I say, well, that's not what the we means, right? But as with arguing about the canons, you've already lost when you're at that point, right? You're like, but that isn't what that means. Too late, right? Because again, who gets to make meaning? The hearer, right? The hearer gets to decide what things mean. So yeah, so the Nicene Creed is a great example. Also, it doesn't actually say we, does it? Credo, I believe. Right? That's not how we translate it. And there's reasons why. They go back to the 4th century, right? They go back to the Athanasian crisis, why we translate that or treat it as a plural. This we that has that has almost a coercive, it's almost a coercive we. It's different than the nurse's we, but very similar, you're right. So the nurse's we is just like, hey, I'm just going to act like we're sharing, like I'm out too, right? The teacher, of course, doesn't, right? The teacher does not believe that the teacher is also going to, go sit on the rug, right? Let's all go sit on the rug. No, we're not all going to go sit on the rug. Just the unruly kid, right? What it is it's a misuse of another kind of we that we haven't even talked about yet, which is called the inviting we. And here what you're doing, and this one is really important, it's tricky, but it's so good for preaching, so try and hold this in your mind, right? Here what we're going to do is we're speaking to a group of people who may or may not identify with the we at first, but might want to, right? So who's the master of this? Martin Luther King Jr., right? Listen to some of his sermons or speeches when he's saying, well, we in the civil rights movement, and here he's made a marker, right? This is what linguists call a marker. We in the civil rights movement. So now we know who the we is. The we is people who are part of the civil rights movement. We believe that such and such a thing, right? That all people should be treated equally. And then I'm sitting back there and I think, well, I think that must mean I'm part of the civil rights movement, even if I didn't think I was, right? And it's the opposite of what you're describing, because it's not a position of power to say, now we're all going to go over onto the reading rug, right? But to say, all of us who are in this group have this. And you think, well, I have that. I must be part of this group, right? And so that inviting we is really important, but you got to make careful, right? And it has a power differential, because I'm speaking for this whole group, which I have to have the authority to do somehow, right? But it's going to come in the context of drawing people in to participating in something. So here, instead of that non-consensual invitation to participate or requirement to participate, it is invitational, right? Please come and join us over here. And this is a sort of, it's evangelical, it can be, right? To say, look, here's what we are here. Here's what it means to be part of this group. And if you're like that, you might be part of this group too. Sometimes these we's, and when I say there's lots of different kinds of we's, one of the kinds of we's is the absolutely genuine we, right? This is all of us, right? But this one in particular is great because this is good for the church, right? This is formational, right? This is a formational we. And so when your professors say, we go to chapel at least on Monday, right? Or whatever, right? That's okay, that's what we're doing, right? Or whatever day it is in your community that we all go.
It's chapel.
Yeah, that's right.
We're going to play that.
Exactly. So that's the kind of thing, right? That kind of teaching or formational, or like, this is what it means to be part of this group, right? That's really important for the church. Okay, so here's what I want to say, and then we can take some more questions. But where all this wraps up is not just about the linguistic or rhetorical things about what you say from the pulpit. And it's definitely wider. We've already talked about examples wider than just saying I or we. Because if it's about love, if it's about agape, if it's about relationship, it's about more than your preaching, or more than what you say from the pulpit. How about that? Because here's a reality of life as a pastor. Outside of a crisis, the relationship that your congregants are having with you is mostly through your preaching. That's how they get to know you. And that can be kind of a challenge. Those of you who are working preachers, working pastors, you know this is true. There's 400 of them in one of you, and they all know which one you are because you're standing up there and they recognize you in the grocery store and everything. And out of context, chances are you got no chance of doing the same. But they won't think that, right? They'll think, I'm having this, I know all kinds of stories about my pastor and their family, and I know about, all kinds of things. I know where they went to school, and I know where they live, and I know what kind of car they drive, all these things that you've shared about yourself from the pulpit and in other things. You don't necessarily know that about your congregation. And that means you're in an imbalanced relationship. And that does not mean you have to go around and know what kind of car everybody drives, or stop sharing that about yourself. Just know that that's what's happening, right? You're having a relationship with your congregation, collectively and individually, that is not the same as the relationship they are having with you. Now, inside of a crisis, right, when somebody's mom or loved one is in the hospital, and you go to visit them in the hospital, whoever shows up to visit them in the hospital, they better recognize. That goes back to self-awareness and knowing which one you are, right? These are all related facts. Because if you're preaching, if your authority to lead the community, if your authority to speak on Sundays or at other times, or to lead in a vestry meeting, or to write a letter to the editor in your town's paper or whatever, is based on the relationship that you are having with them, you have to attend to it at all times, right? If you have created a character in your mind called the preacher, who, has this particular way of speaking, for example, or you have a particular way of carrying yourself in the pulpit, but that's not how you are in vestry meetings and in counseling sessions and at the grocery store, it can be a little bit different because there are different concerns, right? I'm not saying you have to be exactly alike. However, don't be too different, or else the person will say, I thought I was talking to my priest. Who is this person?
You're like the Wizard of Oz.
Exactly, yeah, you're like the Wizard of Oz. And it can happen because you can decide you're standing behind the pulpit and you're thinking, this thing is sort of protecting and concealing me a little bit. And I know preachers who have gotten in a lot of trouble, and in a very different way, right? You'd think you would get in trouble for being sort of weaker in the pulpit than you are out in the world. Actually, the opposite is much more likely, right? It's much more likely that you're prepared to make some kind of bold social justice statement from the pulpit because you're like, behind the scripture, and you got this giant box that you're standing in, and everyone is looking up adoringly at you, and you're like, hey, this is awesome. And then somebody's like, okay, but are you coming to the protest on Tuesday? And you're like, I don't think I'm comfortable doing that, right? So, and that can be a serious issue for your relationship, right? So, this question of relationships of preaching, because it's not just about what you do in the pulpit. Sometimes I would ask my students, when does your sermon begin?
When you show up.
Yeah, when you show up in the morning, when you step up into the pulpit, when you show up in the morning, when you, maybe a sermon that you'll give a year or 5 years from now has begun this week somehow. Right? God calls people to this work. And also, I'm sure you've discovered this, God is all-powerful and all-knowing, but not all concerned with time. At all. Right? I love time, right? It matters to me a lot, like being on time and ending on time. This is not a quality of the divine, right? Timeliness, not one of them. So who knows when your sermon begins? Your sermon begins, whenever it does. All right, so the way I want to wrap all this up is to say this. Your sermons, your authority to preach, is complicated these days. It's complicated these days by changes to our society, to our church, and to the way things work, such that some of the easy answers we've had in the past are no longer that easy. And again, just to link back to what Yehuda said, they haven't gone away, don't misunderstand me. They're still effective in many places. So don't jettison them and say, well, I don't need to do that, right? But the question of why would someone come to your church? Why will they listen to your preaching? Why will they turn over their life to Jesus? Why will they do this? It's not because you yourself are so holy, but because you yourself are so loving.